A fist shot toward a man's jaw. He wasn't even looking. His hand came up, caught the wrist midair, and turned it until the big attacker dropped to one knee. A second man rushed in from the side. A palm met his chest and stopped him cold. The whole hall went silent. 1,000 guests in evening clothes, and not one of them breathed. Reporters froze with their cameras half raised. At the center of it all, one young man stood perfectly calm, one hand resting on the head of an old German shepherd that had not made a sound. He had been called a fraud in front of all of them only minutes earlier. A pretty face. An actor who had never fought a real day in his life. His name was Kelvin Chow. What made a room full of powerful people stop laughing? Stay with me on this one. Let me take you back an hour before any of that happened. The gala was the biggest event of the season. Golden Harvest had just built a new sound stage, the largest in Hong Kong, and every studio boss, every director, every star who mattered was there to see it. Waiters carried trays of champagne between marble pillars. A band played soft music in the corner. 2,000 people, all in their finest clothes, all watching each other to see who mattered and who didn't. That's what a night like that really is, when you strip away the music and the lights. It's a room full of people measuring each other, deciding who's up and who's on the way down. And they do it fast. In a room like that, a man can be sorted, judged, and dismissed before he's finished shaking the first hand. And into this room walked a 26-year-old who had just spent 5 years in America. Kelvin Chow didn't look like much of a threat. That was the first thing people noticed. He was lean, not big. He wore a plain dark suit when everyone else wore silk. He didn't push toward the important people. He didn't laugh too loud or grab a drink or work the room. He just walked in quietly, and beside him, on a short leather leash, walked an old German shepherd with gray around his muzzle. The dog's name was Shadow, and Shadow went everywhere Kelvin went. Now, here's the thing about that room. Everyone in it had already decided who Kelvin Chow was. They'd read the trade papers. They knew the story. The boy had left for California as a nobody, done a few small parts on American television, and somehow come home with a lead role in Golden Harvest's biggest picture of the year. To them, that meant only one thing. He'd gotten lucky. He'd charmed someone. He was a face, nothing more. A model who'd stumbled into a fighter's part because the camera liked his cheekbones. And that kind of story spreads fast in a small industry. By the time Kelvin walked through the door, the rumor had already walked through it ahead of him. People who had never met him spoke about him like they knew him. The lucky boy, the face, the fraud in a nice suit. So when the real man finally arrived, quiet and lean with a gray-muzzled dog at his side, they weren't looking at him at all. They were looking at the story they'd already been told, and the story said he was nothing. They weren't cruel about it, not at first. They were worse than cruel. They were polite. They smiled at him the way you smile at a child who's wandered into a grown-up's party. A director patted his shoulder and said, "The camera loves you, my boy. Don't worry about the fighting. We have stuntmen for that." Kelvin just nodded and said thank you. He didn't argue. He never argued. He knelt down instead and scratched Shadow behind the ears, and the dog leaned into his hand. And for a moment the two of them were the only calm things in that whole loud room. A younger actor sidled up to him, all teeth and cologne, and asked him what it was like in Hollywood, which parts he'd read for, which famous names he'd met. And Kelvin answered every question honestly and gave away nothing at all. He asked the young man about his own work and listened like it mattered, and the young man walked away puzzled because he'd come to feel important and left feeling like he'd been the one being studied. That was Kelvin's way. He asked more than he answered. He watched more than he spoke. In a room full of people desperate to be seen, he was the one man perfectly content to be invisible. But somebody was watching him. Somebody who mattered more than a director with a soft handshake. Her name was Vivian Loke. If you didn't know Hong Kong cinema in those years, you have to understand what that name meant. Vivian Loc had produced 40 films. She had made careers and ended them with a single phone call. She was in her 50s, sharp as a blade, and she wore her power the way other women wore jewelry. When she walked across a room, people moved out of her way without being asked. She'd built her whole reputation on one idea, and she said it to anyone who'd listen. Real films are made by real people. Not pretty boys, not lucky nobodies. She had earned that hardness too. She'd started with nothing, in an industry that didn't want a woman anywhere near the money or the decisions. She'd been laughed out of rooms herself, 30 years before, by men who thought a woman couldn't tell a good picture from a bad one. And she'd answered them the only way that shut them up. She'd worked twice as hard, taken twice the risks, and buried every one of them under a stack of hit films. She'd been underestimated her whole life. And somewhere along the way she'd decided the world was divided cleanly into two kinds of people, the ones who'd suffered for it and the frauds who hadn't. There was no third kind, and Kelvin Chow in her eyes was both a fraud and an insult. She had been against casting him from the start. She'd told the studio he was a mistake, that the first time he threw a punch on screen the whole picture would fall apart. She'd sat in the casting meeting and argued until her voice went flat, and watched the men around the table nod along, and then do exactly what they'd already planned to do. They'd cast him anyway over her objection. That, believe me, was something Vivian Loc did not forgive. Not the boy, the room, the feeling of being overruled, of being the smartest person at the table and losing anyway. That was an old wound, and Kelvin had walked in and pressed a thumb straight into it without even knowing it was there. So she watched him from across the room. She watched him kneel to his dog. She watched him turn down a drink. She watched the young man refuse to play the game everyone else was playing, and instead of respecting it, it made her angry. Because to Vivian, his quiet wasn't humility. It was arrogance. A boy who thought he was above proving himself. She had spent her whole life proving herself, over and over, in front of people who never gave her the benefit of the doubt. And here was this pretty child who wouldn't even bother. The more calm he stayed, the angrier she got. That's the thing about a person carrying an old wound. They can look at gentleness and see contempt. They can look at peace and call it pride. She set down her glass. She smoothed her dress. And she started walking toward the center of the room where the studio boss was about to give a speech and where a single microphone stood waiting on a small raised platform. Kelvin didn't see her coming, but Shadow did. The old dog lifted his head. His ears went flat. A low sound started somewhere deep in his chest, so quiet only Kelvin could hear it. And Kelvin put a hand on the dog's back and murmured something, and the sound stopped. But the dog kept watching Vivian Loc cross that floor. Animals know things before people do. Remember that. It matters later. The studio boss tapped the microphone and the room began to hush. He thanked everyone for coming. He talked about the new sound stage, about the future, about the exciting young talent joining the Golden Harvest family. And he gestured toward Kelvin, and a polite ripple of applause went around the room, and cameras turned and flashbulbs popped. That was the moment Vivian Loc chose, right there, in front of everyone. She stepped up onto the platform, uninvited, and took the microphone out of the studio boss's hand. He was too surprised to stop her. You could see it on his face, that half second where he almost reached for it and then didn't, because you do not grab a microphone back from Vivian Loc in front of 2,000 people. He just stepped aside. And she turned to face the crowd with a smile that wasn't a smile at all. "Before we celebrate our new star," she said, and her voice carried to every corner of that enormous room, "let's be honest with each other. Just once." The room went quiet in a different way now. The nervous kind. Because everyone there knew that voice, and they knew what it meant when Vivian Loc asked to be honest. It never ended well for somebody. "We are giving the lead in a martial arts picture," she said, To a young man who has never fought a real day in his life, a model, a television face from America, she let that sit. I have made 40 films. I have worked with real fighters, men who bled for their craft, men who came to the set with broken hands and worked anyway. And I am telling you, all of you, that this. She pointed her finger straight at Kelvin. This is not a fighter. This is an actor, a pretty picture we are all going to pay to hang on a wall. Nobody laughed yet, but you could feel it building. That awful energy that runs through a crowd when someone powerful decides to make someone weak the joke of the evening. 2,000 people leaning in the same direction at once, all of them waiting for permission to enjoy it. I have watched him all night, Vivian went on, warming to it now. Standing in the corner, too important to talk to any of us, hiding behind a dog. They all have the same look, boys like him. They think the world owes them something because a camera happens to like their face. I have buried better talents than his under the films I've made. And I will not stand here and applaud while this studio hands the craft. I gave my life to a boy who thinks fighting is something you do for the camera. Kelvin stood very still. 2,000 faces turned toward him. Every reporter in the room had their pen out now, their cameras up. This was the story. This was tomorrow's headline. Vivian Loch destroys the studio's golden boy at his own party. Tell me I'm wrong, Vivian said into the microphone, still looking right at him. Go on, you've been so quiet all evening. Say something. Or is that the problem? A man who can't fight and can't even speak for himself. And now the laughter came. It started near the front and spread back through the room like a wave, that cruel, relieved laughter of people who are just glad it isn't them up there. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman actually clapped. A man near the platform called out something, and the people around him roared, and for a moment the whole room belonged to Vivian Loch completely. She had them. Every single one of them was hers. Here is where most young men would have done one of two things. They would have shouted back, gotten angry, made a fool of themselves, or they would have shrunk, gone red, mumbled an excuse and slunk toward the door. Kelvin Chow did neither, because at that exact moment, Shadow began to growl. The old dog had felt the hostility in the room turn solid. 2,000 people laughing at his master, all that ugliness pointed in one direction and the animal's whole body had gone tight. His lips pulled back. That low growl climbed higher, and a few people near the front stopped laughing because a growling German shepherd, even an old one, is not a thing you laugh at. Kelvin turned away from the microphone, away from Vivian Loch, away from all of it, and he knelt down on the marble floor in front of his dog. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at the woman who had just humiliated him in front of the entire industry. He put both hands on either side of Shadow's graying face, and he lowered his own face close, and he spoke to the dog in a voice too soft for anyone to hear. Easy, he said. Easy now, not them. Not for this. And slowly the growl faded. The dog's body loosened. The ears came up. Shadow licked his master's wrist once and sat. The room let out its breath, and you could feel everyone deciding the same thing at the same time. It was over. The boy had folded. He'd knelt down to hide behind his dog rather than answer the woman who'd called him a fraud. Vivian Loch had won. Some of them even felt a little sorry for him. A pretty face and not even the spine to defend it. A few of them looked away, the way you look away from something you'd rather not have seen. Nobody enjoys watching a man break, not really, not once it's actually happening in front of them. Vivian smiled and lifted the microphone again, ready to finish him off. The waiters started moving again. The band picked up their instruments. It was done, except it wasn't done, not even close. Because Kelvin Chow rose from the floor and he turned around and he was smiling. Not an angry smile, not a hurt one. A calm, easy, almost gentle smile, the kind a man wears when he's just made a decision and feels lighter for it. And he walked toward the platform. Slow, unhurried steps, the dog padding along at his side. And every single person in that room felt the temperature change and had no idea why. He stopped at the foot of the platform, looked up at Vivian Loke, and asked her one quiet question. "May I borrow the microphone for 1 minute?" She was so surprised she handed it to him. That's the truth of it. She'd braced for anger, for tears, for an argument she could crush. She had not braced for politeness. A man who says please calmly after you've torn him apart in front of the world is a man you do not know how to fight. So she gave him the microphone, mostly because she couldn't think of a reason not to. Kelvin turned to face the crowd. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The room had gone so silent you could hear the ice settling in the champagne buckets. "Madam Loke is right about one thing," he said. "I've never told any of you what I did in America. I never talk about it, so you all filled in the blanks. That's fair. That's my fault." He paused. "But I'd like to correct the record, just once, and then I'll leave and you can go back to your evening." He looked at Vivian. "You have 3 men with you tonight. The ones by the doors, your security." Everyone's eyes flicked toward the back of the room, where 3 very large men in dark suits stood along the wall. "I'd like to invite any of them, all 3 if they like, to come up here and find out for themselves whether the actor is bluffing." The room made a sound then, a single sharp intake of breath from 2,000 people at once. Vivian Loke laughed. "You can't be serious." "I'm completely serious," Kelvin said and handed the microphone back to her. "Nobody gets hurt. You have my word on that. I'll even let them start. Now, before I tell you what happened next, I want you to do one small thing. If you're the kind of person who's ever been underestimated, ever been judged before you got the chance to show what you're made of, then you already know how Kelvin Chow felt standing there. And if this story is landing with you the way I hope it is, take 1 second right now and hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps me keep telling stories like this one. That's all I'll ask. Now let's get back to that room." Vivian Loke should have said no. Any sensible person would have. But she was proud and she was angry, and 2,000 people were watching, and she could not stand the idea of backing down in front of them. You have to remember what backing down meant to a woman like her. She'd spent 30 years never once giving ground, because the first time she did, she believed they'd take everything. So she turned to the 3 men by the wall and she gave a small nod, and they came. The first man was the biggest, military big, thick through the neck and shoulders, moving with the easy confidence of someone who has never lost a fight in his life. He climbed onto the platform and Kelvin stepped down off it, into the open space at the center of the room because he wanted everyone to see. The crowd pulled back into a wide circle. Chairs scraped. People climbed onto them to get a better view. Shadow sat at the edge of it, still as a statue. "Whenever you're ready," Kelvin said. The big man didn't wait. He threw a punch that would have knocked out a horse. And this is the part where you need to slow down and really see it, because it happened in about 1.5 seconds, and if you blink you miss the whole thing. Kelvin didn't step back. He stepped in. He moved toward the punch instead of away from it, which is the last thing any untrained person would ever do, and his forearm brushed the big man's wrist just enough to send the punch sliding past his ear. Then his hand closed around that wrist and he turned. That was all. He turned his hips, and the big man's own momentum lifted him off his feet and carried him down onto the marble floor, hard, flat on his back, with a sound that made the whole room flinch. The man wasn't hurt. That was the strange part. Kelvin had guided him down, not thrown him. But he was down, staring up at the ceiling with the stunned expression of a man who cannot understand what just happened to him. Nobody laughed now. The second man came in fast and low, trying to grab Kelvin around the waist, take him to the ground where size would win. He'd seen his friend go down and decided the trick was in the hands, so he'd keep away from the hands. Kelvin dropped his weight, slid to the side, and the man caught nothing but air. A hand pressed lightly between his shoulder blades, using his own speed against him, and he stumbled forward and had to catch himself against a pillar. He turned around, breathing hard, and the look on his face wasn't anger anymore. It was something closer to fear, because he understood now that the size didn't matter, that it had never mattered, that he'd walked into something he didn't have a name for. The third man was smarter. He'd watched the first two. He didn't rush. He came in careful, hands up, feinting, circling, looking for an opening. He threw a jab to test, then another, keeping his weight back, waiting for Kelvin to reach so he could counter. He was, by any measure, a genuinely dangerous man, and he fought like one. Then he committed. The real punch came behind the feint, fast and true, everything he had. That was the punch you saw at the very start of all this. The one Kelvin caught without even looking, because his eyes were already on the man's shoulder, reading the strike before it came. He caught the wrist midair, turned it just enough to fold the big man down onto one knee and held him there. Not twisting, not hurting, just holding. Showing everyone that he could have done far worse and chose not to. 90 seconds, 3 of the biggest, most dangerous men in that room. And Kelvin Chow hadn't thrown a single punch of his own. He'd hardly broken a sweat. He let go of the third man's wrist, offered him a hand up, and the man, to his own astonishment, took it. The silence in that hall was the loudest thing I've ever tried to describe to you. Then Kelvin walked back to the platform, looked up at Vivian Loke and said, quietly, without the microphone now, so that only the people close by could hear, "I spent those 5 years in America teaching, not acting. I taught close quarters defense to people whose lives depended on getting it right. I took the film role because my teacher was dying and he asked me to. He wanted our art in front of the whole world, done properly, by someone who actually knew it. That's the only reason I'm here." Vivian Loke didn't say anything. For the first time all night, the most powerful producer in Hong Kong had nothing to say. "You called me an actor," Kelvin went on. "You're right, I'm going to act in your film and I'm going to do it well, but I didn't come home to prove I could fight. I came home to keep a promise to a dying man. I'd have let you call me a fraud all night. I don't care what this room thinks of me." He glanced down at Shadow, sitting patiently at the edge of the circle. "But my old dog there, he's 14. He was my teacher's dog before he was mine. And when 2,000 people started laughing at me, he thought he had to protect me. At his age, with his heart. And I couldn't let him carry that, not for something as small as my pride." He looked back up at her. "So I did this instead, so he'd know he didn't have to." And that, right there, was the reason behind the restraint. That was why he'd knelt on the floor instead of fighting back. That was why he'd smiled. He wasn't protecting himself from Vivian Loke's words. He was protecting a 14-year-old dog from a fight the old animal was ready to have on his behalf. You could have heard a pin drop. Vivian Loke stood there on that platform, holding a microphone she no longer knew what to do with, in front of 2,000 people who had just watched everything she'd said get turned completely inside out. And something happened in her face. The hardness didn't crack so much as it simply melted, all at once, the way ice does when you finally bring it into a warm room. Because here's what you have to understand about Vivian Loke. She had built her entire life on the idea that talent had to be earned through suffering, that pretty things were false and hard things were true. And she had just watched a young man take the worst humiliation she could throw at him, and answer it not with anger, not with revenge, but with tenderness, toward an old dog. He'd had every reason to destroy her in front of the whole industry, and instead he'd been gentle. That was a kind of strength she had never once considered in 50 years of making films, and it broke something open in her. She set the microphone down. She stepped off the platform, and in front of everyone, in front of every reporter and every camera and every person who'd laughed at him 20 minutes earlier, Vivian Loc walked up to Kelvin Chow and bowed to him. A deep, formal, old-fashioned bow, the kind you give a teacher. "I was wrong about you," she said. She didn't whisper it. She wanted the room to hear. "I have been wrong about a great many things, I think, and I am too old to keep being wrong so loudly." Kelvin bowed back just as deep. And then the strangest thing of the whole night happened. Vivian Loc knelt down, this proud, feared woman in her expensive dress, right there on the marble floor, and she held out her hand to the old German shepherd. Shadow looked at her for a long moment, the way dogs do when they're deciding about a person. Then he got up, walked over, and pressed his gray head into her palm. The room broke into applause, not the cruel kind from before, the real kind. It went on for a long, long time. Now I could end the story there and it would be a good ending. But there's a little more, and it's the part that matters most, so stay with me another minute. The film they made together became one of the biggest hits of the decade. That much you could probably guess. But it wasn't Kelvin's fighting that made it work, though the fighting was real and people could tell. It was something quieter than that. Vivian Loc produced it, and she fought for every frame of it, and she made sure the world saw the art the way Kelvin's dying teacher had wanted it seen, done properly, by someone who knew. The two of them became close. Not romantic, nothing like that. Something better, maybe. She became the fiercest defender he ever had. Any time some critic or executive tried to dismiss him as a lucky face, Vivian Loc would appear out of nowhere, sharp as ever, and take them apart. The woman who had tried to end his career in front of thousands spent the rest of hers making sure no one else ever got the chance. And she asked him once why he'd forgiven her so easily. Why he'd never once thrown that night back in her face, never held it over her, never made her small the way she'd tried to make him small. Kelvin thought about it for a while. Then he said something she never forgot, and she repeated it in interviews for years afterward. "My teacher told me that any fool can win a fight," he said. "The whole point of learning to fight is so that you almost never have to, so that when someone comes at you with everything they've got, you have enough control to give it back gently. Anger is easy. Anyone can throw a punch in anger. It takes real training to keep your hands open when every part of you wants to close them." Shadow lived another year after that gala. He died quietly in his sleep at the foot of Kelvin's bed, and Kelvin buried him himself in a garden, under a stone with no words on it, because the old dog had never needed words. Vivian Loc came to stand beside him that day. She didn't say anything either. She just put her hand on his shoulder, this hard woman who had learned, late in life, that the strongest thing a person can do is be gentle when they don't have to be. Think back to how this all started. A room full of powerful people, laughing. A finger pointed. A young man called a fraud in front of everyone he'd have to work with for the rest of his life. 2,000 strangers deciding they knew exactly who he was before he'd said a single word. He could have answered that with rage. He had the skill to humiliate every person in that hall. Instead, he knelt down on the floor to comfort an old, frightened dog and told him he didn't have to fight anymore. That was the whole answer. That was the man. The ones who talk the loudest about what they are, believe me, are almost never the real thing. The real ones are quiet. They don't need you to know. They've got nothing to prove to a room because they already proved it long ago to the only teacher who ever mattered to them. And when the whole world laughs at them and dares them to prove it all over again, they'll often just smile and kneel down and take care of something small and loved that can't take care of itself. Kelvin Chow walked into that gala as a pretty face who got lucky. He walked out as the most respected man in the room, And he never once raised his voice to do it. That's the part I hope stays with you. Not the 90 seconds where he took apart 3 trained men without throwing a punch. The moment before it. The moment he chose an old dog's peace over his own pride in front of the whole world and didn't care what it cost him. Because that, in the end, is what real strength actually looks like. It looks a lot like gentleness. And most people go their whole lives never learning the difference. Take care of yourself. And take care of the ones who'd fight for you, even the ones with gray in their muzzles. They know who you are long before anyone else in the room ever will.